Michael McNamara, 4.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Lascan Corla, for the opportunity to speak on this private member's motion, which I believe is a shameless attempt to hijack the 100th anniversary of the 1913 lockout, to promote a range of agendas that are as colourful and meaningless as the technical group collective, Deputy Higgins. The 1913 lockout has an honourable place in Irish history, and the terrible events of that tumultuous period undoubtedly influenced and shaped the Ireland that evolved in the coming years right up to today. When I think of that period, I think of people like Paddy Hogan, a Labour Party TD from Clare, who was involved in the initial setup of trade unionism in Clare at the beginning of the 20th century. As a young man, he joined the Gaelic League and the Irish Volunteers and was involved in the 1913 strike. He was arrested and jailed before being deported to England. Returning home, Paddy Hogan fought for union recognition in Clare, and indeed continued to fight for union recognition throughout his life, particularly at Shannon after its establishment. He was a major contributor to the Irish Worker Union publication in 1913, and was acknowledged as a major strategist for the union in the republication of that magazine earlier this year. When the Ennis United Labourers Union was brought into the IT and GWU in 1919, Paddy Hogan demonstrated his leadership and pragmatism. He favoured rights of workers over the ego of the individual and favoured amalgamation with larger unions. He continued to support trade union amalgamation throughout his life. Not something that I'm sure would be supported by the proponents of tonight's motion, who would instead prefer to see the splintering of the trade union movement, the weakening of Congress, and with it the weakening of workers' ability across this state to bargain their labour against powerful economic forces. And those economic forces are stronger now even than they were 100 years ago, due to the globalised world in which all nations, with the possible exception of North Korea, must operate. And while I appreciate that the ideological purity of North Korea, if not the downright misery of the place, might appeal to Deputy Higgins, it's not a state that we in the Labour Party would like to see replicated here. Paddy Hogan was a major player in the trade union movement on a national level, and his passion for workers' rights meant that he stayed to fight for workers' rights throughout the bitter civil war, which he did not partake in. During that civil war, there was a blockade of Ennis, and Hogan reacted by appropriating supplies for distribution among the labourers of the town who could not acquire food elsewhere. But of course, caught up in the demagoguery of the technical group, you probably only remember him as the Count Corla who met JFK at Shannon Airport. No doubt you'd probably criticise him for having greeted JFK, because regardless of JFK's achievements for the poor that he and the Democratic Party represented in the States, he wasn't perfect. I'm sure many in the technical group would rather have seen Pol Pot arrive at Shannon Airport, and that's Pot, the Cambodian dictator, as opposed to any contraband substance. Would rather see him arrive at Shannon Airport than JFK. But that's the reality of the colourful group which proposed tonight's motion. I thought there were a lot of signatures by your technical group colleagues, Deputy Higgins. I think JFK did many bad things, but he also did some good things, and it seems, Deputy Higgins, that you and some of your members of the technical group are completely incapable to see any good wherever it arises, that you only see the difficulties, unless, of course, perhaps in an ideologically pure state, as I have mentioned, North Korea, perhaps. I also think, I'm speaking about Paddy Hogan, if you don't mind, who was my predecessor in the Clare Labour Party. I think of Hogan as a practical man who provided good and responsible leadership in times of great hardship. He wasn't a reckless demagogue who misleads people with false promises and an El Dorado that simply can't be achieved. The proposers of this motion seek to cast themselves in the heroic mould of the tragic characters of Plunkett's Strumpet City. They rant and rail against the world in very general terms, and against the Labour Party, of course, in particular. Their shrill voices and empty rhetoric is not only useless, however, it is dangerous. Like bad generals, they lead their troops to the top of the hill and promptly abandon them and scatter for the officers' mess. Decent turf cutters have been brought into conflict with the Gardaí and the courts. Unfortunate householders who listen to the false gods now face higher household charge penalties and possibly court actions. Responsible trade unionists who negotiate long and hard on behalf of their members are demeaned by these fantasists and accused of selling out 1913. In actual fact, they continue to fight for exactly the same thing which Larkin and Connolly wanted the opportunity to fight for in 1913, which is to be able to sit down and argue for workers' rights in the face of strong economic forces. Sorry, Las Corla?
Sorry, and I've asked you to conclude your remarks.
Okay, I will conclude by simply saying that instead of taking the easy road of sitting and castigating every possible proposal which comes out of government, instead of never seeing the good in anything, the Labour Party took the harder road of going into government. But I have no doubt that had the Labour Party not gone into government, that we wouldn't have seen an increase in that. We wouldn't have seen the restoration of the national minimum wage so soon in the first term of government. We wouldn't have seen the replacement of the JLC system with an equally efficient and effective replacement, and we wouldn't have seen 330,000 low-paid workers taken out of the universal social charge net. On that basis, if not on that basis alone, I oppose this motion, which is merely rhetoric from the